So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about political anthropology, which is essentially the study of power, power and politics globally. I think in some respects political anthropology is maybe a little bit different from political science in the sense that it tends to look at non-state level societies, so a lot of political science tends to focus on state level societies. So in this case we've got kind of an examination of a broad range of different forms of political power. So first we're going to wrap up religion though, so we were talking about religion last time. So I want to give you guys just a couple more things about religion before we move on to this, and we'll actually have a couple examples of where religion was used to justify some aspects of political resistance or power. Then we'll talk about political anthropology, social control, and if we have time, we'll get to cultures in contact. We're kind of getting to the end of this semester, so on Friday, I was anticipating that we would probably watch a movie in this class, so we'll see how far we get. Quiz 3, just as a heads up, is next Monday, so just make sure that you attend that, and quiz questions should be posted at the end of the semester. Yes? Or not semester, end of the class, sorry. I'm sorry, so it said... Okay, I think that's a misprint, so yeah, it is due tonight, so sorry about that. So you got until 11:59, yeah, go for the buzzer beater, yeah. I think that went up, yep. Oh, yep, so just go and track it down.
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about different religious specialists. So last time we had talked about different aspects of ritual. What I want to do is just discuss a little bit about who's actually performing some rituals. So basically, religious specialists tend to be divided between priests and priestesses and shamans. So that tends to be kind of this larger division between the two types of groups. So there's a few different characteristics that tend to I would say more accurately describe each of these professions. So for one, priests tend to be more socially initiated. So you can think about priests as potentially having some sort of a formal schooling or some sort of a formal form of recognition that they have some sort of a supernatural mediation or power. So in some respects, they tend to be a little bit more formalized. So you can think of different, perhaps priests or pastors that you might have known, or rabbis. In some respects, they tend to have some sort of a formal schooling. So they've gone to some specific location to learn sacred knowledge and to bring that back to individuals. For the most part, they also tend to have a rank or a ranking system. So you can think about differences between like a high priest, right? You guys have probably heard the term high priest, for example. There tends to be more of a ranking system. So there tends to be a power structure that's going on there. Some priests or priestesses, you can think of the Catholic Church as a good example of this. So you have priests within the Catholic Church, but you also have bishops, you have archbishops, you have the Pope, right? Those are all considered to be priests within the system, but they also have some sort of a ranking. For the most part, priests and priestesses tend to be more full-time in terms of their occupation or specialization. So that means that if you decide to go into a monastery and become a friar or something like that, that pretty much means that that's what you're doing for your entire day. So that basically becomes your profession if you choose this path. So on the other hand, shamans are a little bit different. So shamanism tends to be associated with different types of religions, especially in the Americas, and especially in different parts of the old world, so parts of Eastern Asia tend to have more shamanic practices than others. And for the most part, they're a little bit different. So So for one, shamans tend to draw power from some sort of an event. So this could be some sort of a life crisis that they have. Some shamans, like the Hmong shaman that's shown here, I think that's him. He actually drew some of his power as a religious specialist from nearly dying as a child. So coming very close to the brink of death can also sort of give somebody some sort of a supernatural power or force. For the most part, shamans have a tendency to try to diagnose the soul. So if you're potentially going in because you're feeling ill or something is potentially wrong with you, what a shaman might try to do is find some sort of way to diagnose what's wrong with your soul. So that tends to be something that happens with shamans that maybe it's not happening as much with the priest or priestess. I mean, it maybe happens a little bit, but through this approach, it tends to be more of like prayer that would be associated with trying to help or heal somebody. Shamans are thought to enter the spiritual world. So they sometimes do this through different types of dances. They can do so through different types of chants as well. Some of these are meant to basically leave the profane world and enter the sacred world. In some cases, with a lot of Native American shamans, different types of hallucinogenic drugs can be used to enter the spiritual world, potentially to diagnose somebody's soul. So you can think about this as being a little bit different than priests or priestesses or pastors or rabbis. And in some respects, when you're asking a priest about something, it's not necessary that they travel into a supernatural realm. In some ways, they're considered to be a holy figure that can answer questions, but they're not physically thought of as traveling into a different dimension. Oops. So the last thing I should put down here is that shamans tend to be part-time. So in a lot of different cases, some shamans, especially in Native American cultures and also in Hmong cultures that are in East Asian culture that are present here in the U.S., there's a tendency for a more part-time designation. So that basically means that you might have a job as a plumber during the day, but you might also go and make house calls, go and diagnose somebody's soul within their household. So in that case, it's a bit different than priests and the priesthood in terms of its whether or not it's full-time or part-time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about revitalization movements, and again, this gets a little bit into political anthropology. Revitalization movements are basically religious movements that are meant to restore a former state of being for a society. So in a lot of different cases, revitalization movements tend to happen a little bit more often when society is undergoing some sort of a crisis. So a good example of this is the ghost dance that was present in parts of North America. And basically what had happened was you had a lot of different Native American tribes that were basically suffering greatly due to westward expansion. So you had people that had been dying from disease, people who had lost their culture, people who had lost some of their religious practices. Essentially, the ghost dance was a vision of a shaman, a Paiute shaman, who had this idea that if a certain dance was performed, that basically you could restore the fabric of Native American identity. So this was called the ghost dance. It actually spread to several different groups. And what it was it was a ritualized dance. So this is a depiction of it occurring here. And what was supposed to happen, if it was done correctly, and if it was done by enough Native American tribes, the ancestors were supposed to return to parts of like the Dakotas, for example. The bison were also supposed to return. So as you guys know, the bison they basically got slaughtered by a lot of European Americans. And the last part of this were that European Americans were to leave. So in some sense, what's going on here is it's a religious revitalization, but it's also that attempt to restore the fabric of society. So this actually challenged the U.S. government. It challenged the U.S. Army because in some respects they saw this as a form of resistance. So they saw this as different groups essentially coming together to challenge their power. The after effects of this actually led to the massacre at Wounded Knee. The ghost dance was outlawed by the U.S. government. It caused some different skirmishes involving Sitting Bull, and it eventually ended up with the massacre of Wounded Knee. The kind of irony to that is that massacre in and of itself, the news of that spread to other Euro-Americans in parts of the East Coast that more or less swayed public opinion against these military campaigns against indigenous peoples. So in that respect, they started to back off essentially after this. So in some ways, in some respects, this helped a little bit with Native American society, but nevertheless, there's still a lot of inequity there.
How would you bear that today?
It was a threat. It was a political threat. Cargo cults are also interesting. These appeared in parts of the South Pacific, specifically more in Melanesia. And what's interesting about this is you had a lot of different islands that were actually uncontacted in parts of the South Pacific. And what happened was when Westerners would come through certain areas of the South Pacific, they would sometimes bring different commodities that had basically never been seen before by certain islanders. These commodities that in and of themselves were thought of as being created by the indigenous people's ancestors. And somehow European Americans acquired these items through some sort of I guess you'd say like some sort of trickery. So the idea was that these different items had never been seen before, like a radio, for example. If you've never seen a radio before, this is going to come as kind of a shock to you, but their indigenous explanation for that object was that their ancestors had created this wealth and somehow Westerners had stolen it. So a lot of the contacts between Westerners and Melanesians, for example, tended to be a little bit more sporadic. So they would come there, they might do some business for a certain amount of time, and then they might leave. What's really interesting is that when some Westerners came back to certain islands, they found different aspects of Western society were being imitated by using indigenous ideas. So in this case, there is an entire plane that was built using indigenous materials and methods meant to replicate a plane that was supposed to come back to bring back cargo to that specific community. Same thing goes in Melanesia, the cargo cult called John Frum, which is probably named after a World War II soldier. They don't really know like what the origin of the term or name John Frum is actually from. But you have people here that are essentially mimicking a soldier's perspective. So they're actually carrying what appear to be symbols of weapons, in this case, and marching in form. But basically, this is being done to try to bring back riches. So it's the concept of revitalizing and trying to bring back ancestors to get certain types of riches. So unfortunately, some of the cargo cults tended to die out in the 1960s, I would say, to 1970s. But there are still some that are in practice. So John Frum is one of those in Melanesia, where it's actually been recognized as an official state religion. So there's some really interesting stuff to go along with that. Okay. Any questions on those two examples? Anything? Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about political anthropology. So political anthropology essentially looks at power. And by power, we can more loosely define power as being the transformative capacity, but essentially making somebody do something they wouldn't normally do. So power, you can think about that as some sort of an ability to transform a situation. but also potentially make somebody do something that they normally would not be doing. So in some respects, power tends to be nested. So if you actually look at different types of power structures, or you guys can even look at your own lifestyle and think of different types of power structures that are out there. So you have interpersonal power structures. So you might have, for example, a friend group. And I don't know if you guys have ever had like a bossy friend that's part of your friend group. I think we all have, but don't point at somebody, no. But in some respects, what's going on there is even at basic level, even at your level between people, you have power structures or power dynamics. So that friend might be somebody that might be able to get people to do, something they wouldn't normally do. So I know when I was an undergrad, I knew somebody who had a friend group, and I can't remember what it was. It was like she was from Hawaii, and she wanted people to go back with her to Hawaii, but nobody could really afford it. But she somehow, through her power and coercion in some cases, was able to kind of make everybody pony up all this money to go with her to Hawaii. So in that case, she had this tremendous interpersonal power. You can think of organizational power as well. So, for example, school institutions would be an example of organizational power. So, potentially I have to answer to my department, which my department then has to answer to the school, which the school has to answer to, a dean, or, there's all these different levels of power. But that's organized. It tends to be a little bit more formal, but those levels are still there. You can also think of that as being power that's manifested in different parts of government, for example. So you've got, local government, you've got state government, you've got federal government, you've got international law, right? You've got just all these different levels of power. So power has a tendency to be nested. It can also be structural, so it can be things that are unseen. So power and gender tend to, when Jen was talking a little bit about gender, that's a form of structural power. So in some ways, gender inequity may or may not be explicit, but it still exists as a structure that's embedded within society. So it may be at times difficult to see. Just like things like racism might be difficult to see, but in some ways it's embedded within a structural format within society. So again, different forms or different levels of power. Okay, legitimacy. Legitimacy is basically the right of leaders to govern. So in some respects, this tends to be based on like socially accepted laws or rules, but it's basically the right to govern is legitimacy. So we see legitimacy in a lot of different formats. So actually in primate structures, you actually see legitimacy in the forms of dominant males and dominant females, or alpha males and beta males in some cases. Sometimes, a lot of times, especially for chimps, if different members of a troop don't give legitimacy to a dominant male, he will not stay dominant. So if females within a group do not accept a male as being dominant, he can be thrown out of that position. So in that respect, this seems to be kind of a deep order within primates, that we have some aspects of like how legitimate is somebody in terms of rulership and their ability to exert power. There's two different types of legitimacy. So the first is more of an achieved type of legitimacy. So the big men of Papua New Guinea are a good example of achieved legitimacy. And basically what this means is that if you have an achieved status, it means that it's something that you have done on your own accord. Okay? So in this case, it could be the big men of Papua New Guinea, and they also have big women there as well, that they might be experts at herding pigs or actually breeding pigs. They might be very good at giving those pigs away to other people within the community. But basically, they tend to be self-made. So in this case, their legitimacy is self-made. People can, think of them as more or less their own behavior or actions giving them some form of legitimacy. So that's an achieved status. If different types of rulers and heredity, it tends to be a little bit different. So I think did we? We talked about it, ascribed and achieved in this class. I can't remember if that was in the other class. Okay, so Hawaiian rulers or different types of royalty, you can think about this in terms of royal blood. Ascribed status basically means that you didn't really do anything to get your position. So basically you were born into a specific role. So an ascribed status means that you're born into a certain role. I think last time we had talked a little bit about Mana, and we had talked about different Hawaiian rulers. They were born into royalty, and through Mana, they're able to rule. That's considered to be their legitimacy. The distinction between these two is sometimes a little bit difficult to make. So sometimes an ascribed status, you guys have probably heard the phrase that somebody was born with a silver spoon in their mouth, right? What does that mean?
That everything given to them the whole life.
Yeah, and typically if somebody's born with a silver spoon in their mouth, that phrase, what tends to be their social status? Yeah, they tend to be upper class, right? They're probably not going to lose that status as well. So in some cases, you might have a family that's achieved a social status or legitimacy, perhaps through different types of economic exchanges or whatever, but it's possible that their children might have in some ways an ascribed status because they have access to different types of knowledge, access to different types of wealth, school systems, tutoring, all these different things that fall into that category. So in some respects, we don't really have as much of an ascribed system here in the U.S., but you can think about it in terms of, what are the rights or what's the legitimacy that you tend to be born with. And we do actually have some disparities. That's legitimacy. Hegemony is a little bit different. And this is like one of those $10 words that anthropologists like to throw around all the time. So if you go to like an academic conference, they'll talk about like the hegemonic discourse of such and such a state in such and such a place. Really, what hegemony is, it's kind of a fancy way of talking about the different types of processes that a group uses to stay dominant. So hegemony is basically the social processes that some group or some sort of a ruling class, somebody with power, tends to use to stay dominant. And I'll give you guys a few different examples of this, but in some respects, there tends to be power manipulation to somehow validate authority. So in some cases, this can be, a quest to make it so people recognize rule or power as being legitimate. So it could be the threat of a threat would be an example of hegemony, that if you don't do this particular thing or if you don't recognize me as a ruler, I might attack you. But the key there is might. So that the threat of a threat in that case becomes some sort of a hegemonic practice that's used to keep people within power. There's another good example of this among the Azande. So I think I mentioned to you guys before that the Azande tend to practice witchcraft. And witchcraft tends to be more the explanation as to why good things happen and bad things happen. The issue with witchcraft, though, among the Azande is that if a commoner were to accuse a ruler of witchcraft, it could be a major accusation because in some respects it would have to actually be followed through. So if somebody were to accuse somebody that was higher up of practicing witchcraft on them, it would be a big deal, because in some respects that would violate some of the power structure that exists. So what's interesting is that the Azande elites, what they would do is they actually manipulated the definition of witchcraft, and they associated it with envy. So what they ended up doing is saying that witchcraft happens because of envy. And because rulers don't envy the public, they don't inflict witchcraft on the public. So what this basically means is that the public can never actually accuse the elites of practicing witchcraft on them. So again, this is like a process that you can see is kind of used to maintain control or maintain their position there. So it means that the public's not necessarily able to accuse them of certain things. So in some cases, hegemony isn't enough. So I think I mentioned before that hegemony can mean the threat of a threat, right? So it could be, if you don't do this, something bad is going to happen to you, right? That becomes a hegemonic comment or a hegemonic idea. In some cases, that doesn't always fly, and you actually have full-on domination or coercion that's taking place. So this can be more or less defined as the use of physical force, typically violence against individuals. So think of a lot of dictatorships. Dictatorships tend to fall more on the line of domination. So it tends to be more that people are actually physically attacked if they don't go along with a certain ideology. So you can think about this over time. There's been a lot of dictators that have popped up in different parts of like Latin America. How long do those usually last? Okay, so potentially during somebody's lifetime, right? In the grand scheme of things, though, they tend to roll over pretty quickly, right? So typically, if somebody reaches a power status through violence, that person, they may rule throughout their lifetime, but they also might get ousted within a few years, right? So by the next person who also uses violence to do it. So in some ways, domination tends to be a little bit less stable, because I think in some respects it's not really using a hegemonic system to convince people that their leadership is legitimate. So you can think about, in terms of stability, the U.S. has had a lot of different presidents over time. It hasn't necessarily had certain issues with domination, with the whole government essentially collapsing, right? So you might have differences in political opinion, differences in party viewpoints or whatever, but it's not necessarily the same type of thing as like a military coup and, killing or potentially inflicting violence on people. Okay, so let's talk about social control. So we had discussed a couple different forms of social control earlier on in the semester. So the first is norms, what we call codes as well. So we talked a little bit about indirect constraints and we talked about direct constraints. So essentially this is kind of elaborating on each of those, so I promised you guys that we would come back to this at the end. So what are indirect constraints again? Does anybody remember what those are? Yeah, so they tend to be more social rules, right? So that's the type of thing that governs space, right? It governs how close we talk to individuals. I would say in some respects they tend to be a little bit more implicit. So we don't explicitly tell people, when you speak to somebody, you must be at least 3.5 feet away, right? That would sound bizarre. We just kind of know it through experience. So in that respect, that tends to be an indirect constraint or an indirect norm. Direct constraints, which we'll talk about in a second as well, tends to be more something that's written out into a law. So a little bit more formalized. So among different societies, you actually have variability when it comes to different types of social control. So not everything is just like, you know, a westernized system of a legal system of punishment. So one of these is called dispute resolution. And what that means is that dispute resolution is, for one, not entirely formalized. So this isn't necessarily existing as a law. I would say it's more on the spectrum of being more of an indirect constraint than a direct constraint. In some respects, avoidance tends to be something that band-level societies do. So if you have a conflict with another member in your band, say you're a hunter-gatherer tribe, the biggest thing that you might do is actually start to avoid that person later on. So it could be that you split off from the community, it could be that you go somewhere else, but for the most part, that tends to be kind of the default thing to do if there's some sort of a dispute that's strong enough to warrant it. So avoidance tends to be used a little bit more in band-level societies. You also have negotiation. So negotiation usually means that disputes are resolved between the two relevant parties. So a good example of this is the Inuit song duel. And basically what this is if two people within Inuit society have some sort of a dispute, what they do is they challenge one another to a song duel. This kind of sounds like a rap battle to me, right? So if somebody's potentially asking you or giving you trouble, you actually challenge them to a song duel. Now, what's interesting about this sort of negotiation is that there really isn't a winner that's declared. So there might be an audience that's taking place that actually sees a song duel between two different people. They might clap or give acceptance. But the actual end result, the thing that's actually sought after, is that you end up basically mending whatever sort of conflict is happening. So it's supposed to be like a draw. So it's kind of like airing out your grievances against this other individual, but the end result of dispute resolution tends to be that's more of a draw. So in that case, both parties, agree that they're going to move on from whatever it is that's happening. In some cases, though, that doesn't always happen. So again, you might actually have somebody that leaves a group through avoidance if there's some sort of a dispute that's too strong to settle. So I actually have a short video that it's kind of strange. So this was actually made by an Inuit person. So what you're about to see is it's fictitious. It's a recreation of a song duel, but this was actually done for like a movie that was made in an indigenous style. So what you guys are about to see isn't actually real. It's kind of like a recreation of a song duel, but it nevertheless gives you guys an idea of what this might look like. So hopefully this will run. Okay. So what you're about to see is this is a song duel between two men that are disputing about a wife. So this is what's going on.
Whose wife is this? This is Mr. Rose.
Okay, so that's just an example. Like I said, this was made for a film that was an indigenous film, so that's not actually real, but it gives you the idea of this. So you have two parties, they're basically ritually insulting one another with off-color humor, so that's what was going on there. But the idea, the concept, I'm not sure in that particular case, because they're debating about a wife in that case, so I'm not sure what the outcome could be in that one, but most of the disputes tend to be that you would do that for a while and basically declare a draw, and everybody goes home happy.
Yeah, when your throat starts to hurt from singing too much.
Probably.
Jeez. Just see your friend's face make fun of his sexual life.
Yes,
Profile Sue in there.
Exactly.
Hey, Mark, how's your sex life?
So another form of dispute resolution is what's called mediation. So mediation, in some respects, it's kind of similar, I guess, to more of a Western form of mediation. So you guys have probably heard this with different types of legal disputes in the U.S. But basically, it means that you have a third party that observes the situation, and typically that third party tends to make a decision, and that decision is binding. So what's that?
Like when you go to court.
Kind of like a court case. Kind of like a court case, except in many different cases, this is more on a tribal level. So like in the Capel or chiefdom level as well, you might actually go consult a chief potentially to mediate between two parties. The chief himself or herself, they may or may not actually have the power to physically coerce somebody to do something, but their word is so respected through legitimacy that their actual decision on a particular case or a particular conflict tends to be binding. So that it basically means that because they are legitimate and because they actually have a certain amount of power and are well regarded within society, that people follow what their final opinion is. So you can kind of look at that. I think it's like arbitration is something within U.S. society where sometimes something is given off to a third-party source that you're not necessarily talking about between two parties, but you're going through a third party to essentially resolve something. So Capel are a good example of that. Okay, codified law is a little bit different. So codified law, this tends to be more formalized rules of conduct. So this falls under direct constraints that we were talking about before. So I would say most formal codified law, it's basically the idea that you have formal rules of conduct, and typically if you don't follow one of those rules of conduct, you tend to get punished. So the emphasis is on punishment, that if you're not necessarily doing something correctly, you tend to get punished. So when you think about this is a little bit different than perhaps other societies. So if you guys follow all the rules, all the laws, do you get anything out of that?
No.
Like you don't really get a bonus at the end of the year on your taxes because you followed everything correctly, right? So it tends to be, yeah, you don't get a discount on your vehicle if you didn't run a stop sign, right? But there's a tendency to think about codified law as simply punishing people who don't necessarily fit whatever rules are in place. So for one, though, what's interesting about this in terms of being a little bit different from indirect constraint, codified law tends to define rights and duties explicitly. So it pretty much means that if you really wanted to, you could sit down with a bunch of law books and you could actually go through the books and you could figure out, what the laws actually are, because they should be spelled out, hopefully in clear form. Nobody does this, of course, because we've kind of been raised to think about what's considered to be legal and what's considered to be not legal. But in some respects, this explicitly defines rights and duties versus this kind of implicit aspect of disputes that could happen or something that's a little bit different.
Have you read some of the laws in law books? One about like cows and chickens and no one
Exactly.
no one ties on Wednesdays when mediate or something.
That's true. I wouldn't recommend going back and reading old laws. 'cause
No,
most of
they
them
are weird. They're still
a little bit
there.
weird.
They're
Yeah.
still there. They won't change because like some idiot not to read this.
Right.
Here's
So codified law also becomes justification for coercion. So you can think about this as, enforcing different types of laws. So pretty much, the process of putting somebody in jail or locking somebody away in prison, that's a form of physical coercion, right? But in some respects, codified law tends to justify that. So if it's actually explicitly been written, it essentially allows permission for the judiciary to execute that. In some cases, too, coercion could mean execution. So you have executions that sometimes take place for murder, for espionage, different things like that. But it basically becomes a justification for that. One thing I think people forget about codified law is that it can also allow for social flexibility. So people like to think of certain laws as kind of like constraining them or like keeping them down or whatever. But when you think about it, certain laws that are overturned by the Supreme Court, for example, can actually allow a lot of social flexibility. So the most recent example is the Supreme Court decision about same-sex marriage. So that's a codified law that got overturned that then allows more social flexibility in some cases. So things like the Civil Rights Act are a good example of that as well. Voting Rights Acts, some of those laws are actually put there to allow more social flexibility. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit now about power, culture, and contact. Probably won't have time to get through all of this, so we might have to finish up a little bit on Friday. But basically, the question is what happens when different cultures come into contact with one another. So in several cases, there's a lot of different cultural processes that happen. Anthropologists are interested in these because in some ways it reflects some of the power dynamics that are taking place. So think of colonialism, for example. You had pretty much a very strong power dynamic there. But anthropologists are interested in this because in some ways it sets off different aspects of social change. So acculturation is basically the process in which one social group takes different elements of culture from another social group. That tends to be a blanketed form. I would say most anthropologists don't really use this very much, but I think your textbook uses it, so we'll go along with it. But it tends to be like what sorts of things are borrowed by a particular group. So we talked about language, right, and we talked about linguistic borrowing. In some respects, some elements of linguistic borrowing tend to be different types of elements of acculturation. Assimilation and forced assimilation are perhaps a little bit different. So when we're talking about assimilation or forced assimilation, we're talking about completely replacing somebody's culture with another culture. So a good example of this was some of the forced assimilation that took place in several reservations in the U.S. Southwest. This is basically a boarding school example. So this is a Navajo person that got placed into a boarding school. And basically the idea behind some of these boarding schools was to try to make people more westernized. So this is like literally a before and after picture of somebody that had entered, was forcibly, was forced to attend a particular boarding school. And you can see the differences are profound here. So there's a lot more, when you're talking about culture loss, there's a lot more that was obviously emphasized between when this person came into the school and when they left this school. So in a lot of cases, forced assimilation tends to be associated with colonialism. So it's a tendency to try to force individuals to adopt a completely different culture or lifestyle. This can sometimes result in what's called ethnocide, which basically means the demise or disappearance of a particular culture. So we had talked a little bit about language death last week and what happens when language is lost. In some ways, broad campaigns to try to rid a language from a population tends to be a form of ethnocide, because what you're really trying to do is make it so that culture no longer exists anymore and replaced by some sort of a dominant culture. So you can think about this happening in various places of the world. So a good example is in Tibet. For example, there's a lot of clashes in Tibet between different cultural groups, and basically Tibetans want to hang on to some of their traditional practices and attempted ethnocide to try to get them to give up some of those cultural practices. Sometimes this can exist as a diaspora, or that this can create a diaspora. And basically what a diaspora is, it means, it's actually Greek to scatter seeds. So the spore that's in here, that's actually to scatter seeds. But what it means is that typically if you have repressive governments, there's a tendency for people to flee or migrate into different areas to preserve their lifeways or their customs. So if you think about after World War II, Jewish people were persecuted in Europe. That actually created a very large diaspora of where people ended up going to different parts of the world that weren't in Europe, for example. There's actually, I believe, far more Tibetans today that are in, I think it's Nepal. I think Nepal and India than there are actually in Tibet. But that's actually because they've been dispersed by a lot of these policies that are trying to attack their culture. So ethnocide can sometimes result in this, can sometimes result in people trying to preserve heritage by fleeing into different areas. Tribalization is another form of power. So in this case, this is kind of interesting and also kind of tragic as well. So all of this is kind of tragic from an anthropological perspective. But this is pretty much what North America and Central America used to look like prior to European arrival. So each of these little lines here represents a political border that existed prior to 1492. So you can see that the total outlook of North America is really, really different. So you've got very different political boundaries that are occurring. One thing that's really interesting is that what happened was when Europeans started to expand westward and started encountering more Native American groups, what they tried to do is they tried to execute the process of tribalization on several groups. And what this meant is that in some cases you had a lot of different political entities in different parts of the U.S. And what they essentially did is they took people in and created tribes out of them. So they took different Native American populations belonging to different political entities and more or less said, you will all be grouped together and you'll be known as this specific tribe. So the Navajo, for example, they were actually, we see that today, or we might hear that today and think, oh yeah, it's like this ancient entity, a political entity. In many ways, the Navajo were subject to tribalization. So the Navajo exists today as several different forms of Native American governance that were actually put together forcibly. Same thing goes with different parts of Latin America. So you had Spaniards that were trying to more or less control populations by trying to physically get people into missions in different areas. And by doing that, they actually started to try to give them a new tribal identity that didn't necessarily exist before. So tribalization is the process of creating new political boundaries from older ones. So in some cases, these were not related. People weren't necessarily related. Okay, so I think that we're out of time today. So if you guys need to look at the questions again, here are the quiz questions. They should be posted online.